just shy of 100, so we will kick off. Great. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see a few familiar names. So for those who don't know me, I'm Michael Hopkins, and I'm the CEO and Commissioner of the National Transport Commission. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that we're all on across the country. For me, me and the team are here in the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. A quick note, you will have seen that this session is being recorded, so we can make it available to anyone else who's not able to come today. So if that worries you, you might need to pop out. Without further ado, here at the NTC, one of the major parts of our program is the National Rail Action Plan that we're delivering alongside industry and our government partners. It's a major program of national reform that's making rail in Australia simpler, safer and better. A big theme here is reducing the differences across networks and driving harmonisation to improve interoperability, safety and to attract and develop a skilled workforce for the future. One of the things that we're doing is developing new institutional arrangements to oversee the first approved mandatory standards, working towards agreement on consistent and interoperable digital train control technology, and implementing more consistent ways of working in operations. Ultimately what we're after here is a more efficient network with greater capacity, greater safety, greater mode shift, and then contributing to reduction in emissions and obviously supporting local manufacturing as well. And a big part of that work to make it simpler and easier is how we get new trains running on the network across the country. And that's what we're here to talk about today, streamlining rolling stock approvals. We've been working with industry over the last 18 months to develop options to streamline the rolling stock approval process. And based on this work, ministers back in July last year asked the NTC to facilitate the implementation of 3 key actions: developing guidance on safety assurance to clarify certification, registration and network approval requirements; 2, piloting a single national application approach; and 3, harmonising testing requirements and locations. So today we'll go through those 3 points. We'll share a detailed briefing with you on this work, how you can get involved. We know it's a real pinch point for industry. When we talk to government and industry, one of the clear messages from government is we need a better way of making sure industry is using standards. And the biggest message back from industry is what we really need is a way of harmonising rolling stock approvals and reducing some of the transaction costs there, particularly between different RIMs. So I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the work that RISB has done in this space also, and just to connect them for those of you who are aware of that, and in particular the National Rolling Stock Register. It's an important piece of work and links to the discussion later about a single national application approach. This work that we'll talk about today feeds into the register and will be used to articulate the specific requirements needed for registration. What we're doing will improve the clarity of roles and responsibilities of different parties in the rolling stock approval. And RISB's work on developing a standard on rolling stock registration following their white paper is an important first step there. It's looking at the technical requirements for registration, essentially what are the questions being asked to ensure that rolling stock is fit to operate on a RIMS network. Here at the NTC, we're looking at who does what in rolling stock approvals and the processes used. Also looking at how the whole process from certification, registration and approval can be streamlined and made consistent across networks. That's enough from me, so let's get stuck into it. So we've got here the NTC team of Dom, Daniel and Jonathan. So they've been working hard here. They're in the room alongside 9 Squared and Rail Confidence team that we've engaged to help with us. So I'd like to introduce the 9 Squared directors, Phil Bullock and Tasha Prabhakar, who'll provide the technical briefing today. And they're also joined by Steve Muscat, who's the Managing Director and Principal Consultant at Rail Confidence, a firm specialising in rolling stock design, testing and commissioning. Following that, we'll have some time for Q&As. Now, because we've got so many people in the room, what we've done is we've muted everybody, so we've got 140 people here. So when we get to the questions, what I'd like to do is, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and I'll moderate them and guide the discussion with the team. So with that, I will pass it over to the 9 Squared guys. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'll kick off. we're really pleased to be helping the NTC and the industry with this important program. And I firstly want to just acknowledge and thank all of the people who are joining us today who have provided us with assistance so far. The NTC has been doing work in this space for some time we have been assisting them with some of that work. This program that we're talking to you about today would not be happening if it wasn't supported by the industry. And to date, the NTC and ourselves have received invaluable insights on some of the issues with rolling stock approvals and opportunities for improvements. And so, we're really looking forward to working with people here today on the next phase of work. I'll just talk to give an overview of the structure of our talk. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to us, provide a bit of background on the work, and sort of set the scene with the program, if you like, and talk about what we're trying to get out of this, a little bit about the scope, and then I'll hand over to Tasha and Stephen, who will talk us through some of the projects in a bit more detail, and then we'll talk about some of the risks and next steps at the end. So if you have not heard of us before, 9 Squared is a economics and strategy consultancy. We have offices in Sydney and Brisbane, and we do a lot of work in transport and infrastructure. We are very grateful to have a number of experienced rolling stock experts as part of our team. In addition to Stephen and his firm, Rail Confidence, we also have some other independent experts helping us. Barry Lovett, Brian Turnbull and Warwick Stoddart, who I think some of them are joining us today, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. So just moving on to a little bit about the background for the program. So as Michael mentioned, in earlier phases of the work, the NTC engaged extensively with rolling stock operators and other stakeholders, particularly in the early phases, about some of the challenges associated with rolling stock approvals. And, the key challenge is really around that rolling stock operators using multiple networks need to go through multiple application processes and get multiple approvals. So it's akin to having to register your car or truck in each state that you drive in. Worse, in fact, because there are multiple rail networks within states as well. And so there's inherent complexity in the system, and each network has a unique process for rolling stock applications and making a decision about whether or not to accept rolling stock onto their networks. In a preliminary assessment that we assisted the NTC with, we estimated that the cost of current inefficiencies are around $20 million a year and are likely to increase. That analysis included items that we could quantify, like the time for operators and rail infrastructure managers to prepare and assess applications and associated costs with that for testing and technical support. But what we didn't quantify in that cost were other issues that we did hear about very strongly, particularly from rail operators, including the impacts of current processes on discouraging investment in newer, more innovative rolling stock. And we certainly heard a lot of examples of that. But when we talk about that $20 million figure, that doesn't include those costs. So in reality, it would be much higher. So just with the program and the objectives, I suppose what we're trying to really achieve in overall terms is really to have a situation on the national network of interoperability, and I'll come back to that and talk about what that is for those who aren't familiar with it. But we're trying to get to a situation where rail operators can submit a single application form for access to the national network of interoperability and the networks, the individual networks that comprise that. Operators having assurance that safety risks are effectively managed. We want to see more mutual recognition of certification, testing and approvals by rail infrastructure managers. And ultimately want to see rail infrastructure manager requirements being more transparent and a shared common understanding of roles and responsibilities. That's at a high level, but if we go to the next level down, the specific outcomes that we're trying to get out of this are, all of these projects are to reduce the cost of rolling stock approvals, increase interoperability, increase innovation and competition, and all while maintaining or improving rail safety. So just to give you a brief overview of the three projects that comprise the program, Michael mentioned them at the beginning. So the first project is looking at guidance on rolling stock safety assurance, and that's a foundational piece of work to provide a basis for more harmonised processes. That's work that we've got underway at the moment. The second project is looking at a single national application approach and piloting that for networks on the national network of interoperability. The objective of that is ultimately to reduce the cost of the application process for industry. We're planning to start that work from the middle of this year. And the third project is around harmonising rolling stock test requirements and locations to look at how testing works today and what opportunities are there for streamlining and harmonising processes across different networks. So that obviously ties into those other projects, and we're about to commence work on that from April. The projects that we're doing, the overall program will be done over a 2-year period, and that's really designed around the project sequencing and doing that foundational work, also exploring opportunities to integrate with other relevant projects that are underway that I'll talk to in a moment, and also giving us sufficient time to work closely with the industry, which is the most important thing, because we won't get the outcomes that we want with these projects unless industry are supportive and participating and work with us. So that's an overview of the program. Just a little bit about some related projects. Michael touched on some of this in his introduction. There are more projects. There are quite a few projects actually that are relevant, and no doubt I expect a lot of people who are joining us today have participated in consultations for those projects. But there are 3 in particular that I'd like to call out. Mandatory standards is one piece of work there's work underway being led by the NTC, and that's looking at a range of areas, but one of the areas that has been identified in potential Tier 1 mandatory standards is rolling stock approvals. That work is separate to the program that we're talking to you about today, but they're very much linked. So the outputs of the work that we do may feed into development of a mandatory standard that could ultimately be implemented beyond the work that we're doing. The next project is the review of the Rail Safety National Law, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with. That review recommended that the regulator be given a role to coordinate the delivery of safety and productivity benefits. And that work is also running parallel to the program that we're talking about today. But the NTC and ourselves have been working closely with the regulator to set up a working group with them and to make sure that they're involved in key aspects of the projects that we're talking to you about today. And the third project, which Michael mentioned as well, was the National Rolling Stock Register, which is also highly relevant to the work that we're doing. This is the 2 projects are really complementary. What we're looking at is those underlying processes and protocols that are applied in making decisions about whether or not to accept rolling stock and how they can be harmonised. Ultimately, the reforms that we're looking at, the rolling stock register will be needed to deliver those reforms in the long run, and so it's an important part of the overall picture. So one key thing about this program of work and these projects is that they are looking at what can be done within the current regulatory environment. So we do know there's a range of other projects, including these three, that are happening at the moment that could have longer term implications for the rail environment and different bodies and the roles and responsibilities they have in that. But what we're looking at and focused on for the next couple of years is how can we, what steps can we take now to improve and harmonise processes? And there is nothing in the law today that prevents, that would prevent rail infrastructure managers to work more closely to look at how they can harmonise approvals in this processes in this space. And in fact, that's already happening. So what we're looking at is how we can build on some of that work that's already underway to apply, get a broader group of benefits. So that's just a little bit about some of the related projects underway, but there are also other projects underway that are others. We're talking to stakeholders about those as well. Before I hand over to Tasha and Stephen, I just wanted to talk about briefly the scope, because when you say rolling stock approvals, that's quite a broad term, and we often get the question, well, what are you talking about when you say that? This slide just calls out some of the key processes that we're focused on, and actually RISB have done some really good work in this space to look at more detail. What are the different processes that occur in respect of rolling stock approvals? So when we say that, we really mean three things. Firstly, the process of certifying that rail vehicles comply with standards of different networks. Secondly, the process of registering details of rail vehicles that can use different networks. And thirdly, the process of proving trains to operate networks. And so they are all distinct processes, but they are often done within the same framework or often the same processes, and that's what we're looking at in this program. Next slide, please. So the network and the scope is important. Obviously, to try and get some benefits in this area, we can't change everything overnight. So what this work is focusing on is the national network of interoperability, and that's a network that's been defined by the National Transport Commission after doing a lot of work with the industry. And it's basically the national standard gauge networks that connects major ports and rail terminals around the country. And so within that, there are a range of different rail infrastructure managers that make up that overall network. And there's more information, including an interactive map on the NTC's website for anyone who is interested in getting a bit more information about that. But we are also focused on particular vehicles. So the focus of this work, this program and these projects is very much on freight vehicles. And that's just in recognition of the fact that this is where the bulk of applications for approval, that applications approval mainly relate to those vehicles. We know that passenger rail vehicles also need to go through those approval processes, but less frequently generally than freight vehicles. And so while passenger vehicles are not in scope of the work that we're doing, the processes, harmonised processes that we're looking at could certainly be applied to approvals for those vehicles as well. But also there's other vehicles that use networks that we're not looking at as part of our work. Rail heritage and maintenance and road rail vehicles are not in scope of our work, although we know that there's some very good work that's been done in those spaces too, to look at, particularly for maintenance and road rail vehicles, develop systems and harmonising or streamlining processes for approval of those. And we're looking at potential lessons from those other projects and programs as well. Thanks, Kat. So at this point, I'll hand over to Tasha, who will talk us through the first couple of projects.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks very much, everyone. Really delighted to be here today to talk to you about a couple of the projects we've we've been working on. The first project around guidance on rolling stock safety assurance is really about a response to a lot of conversations we've had with RIMS and rail operators around a lack of clarity or at least a common understanding of roles and responsibilities for safety assurance of rolling stock. So operators believe they ultimately bear responsibility for the safety of their stock and assessing and managing risks, but equally rail infrastructure managers have a requirement to ensure that the rolling stock operating on their network is safe and fit for operation under the network's conditions. So while the Rail Safety National Law, as you're all aware, applies a principle of shared responsibility for safety so far as is reasonably practicable, or SFARP, as you all say, applying this in practice can be challenging. So we appreciate that, and a lot of the feedback we've had is that there can be some uncertainty or a lack of common appreciation or understanding of roles and responsibilities. And this is resulting in some practical implications that are a challenge around an efficient system or set of processes. Add to that, I guess the RIMS have expressed a view that, or some RIMS have, that ONSRA places ultimate responsibility for the safety of the rail network onto them. So in practice, they feel the need to require a lot of information to give safety assurance on rolling stock, testing information and so on, prior to accepting rolling stock on their networks. So, we appreciate that this is complex and there are a lot of different views around this that we need to kind of consider, because it does beg the question, if you like, what is an acceptable approach to safety assurance around rolling stock in this environment? And what measures and requirements can and should be applied that support fulfilling safety duties so far? Also, how are issues resolved when there are conflicts between operators and RIMS about perceptions of responsibility? How does that work? So there are kind of a lot of questions here, and in a way there's not any sort of specific published guidance material available for RTOs to clarify, I guess, regulator expectations for safety assurance for rolling stock approval processes. And understandably, to some extent, ONSRA's current remit, albeit the Rail Safety National Law Review is underway, but it's more focused on safety and currently doesn't produce guidelines relating to interoperability and productivity specifically. So what's the guidance here? How do we try and, the aim of this project is to try and develop some material to help clarify and provide a common understanding of roles and responsibilities, and ideally have some key principles that promote a more efficient, harmonised set of processes for approving rolling stock. So the work that we're doing to date is to look at the evidence based of a detailed review of application forms and supporting information. So what are RIMS looking for in terms of evidence to provide them with assurance that the rolling stock meets standards and will be safe on their network? We're looking at what happens elsewhere and trying to understand, are there examples that we can learn from elsewhere in Europe and other places? And also, of course, looking at engaging with a range of stakeholders, including people on the call today, to try and understand what are your views on some options or ways that we could improve this system to eventually develop some guidance material. So in terms of all of that, I hope that's relatively clear to you all. Just some information, I guess, on what we've done to date, some early findings on our deeper dive into application processes. And thank you to those RIMS who've provided us with some of this information, as well as what we've tried to glean from what's published on websites and so on. And our review so far shows a really vast array of different processes that each RIM has unique process. They request varying levels of information about rolling stock to decide whether it can be used on their network. So in simple comparisons, there's a huge difference in lengths from very short sets of information being requested to very long and detailed application forms of 60-odd pages. We've also been analysing what information is being requested, and what we can see is that, again, there's variation in what type of information is being requested. So some RIMs ask for information about a train, others may focus more on safety-related information but consider train performance, impacts and interfaces with infrastructure. So again, there's quite a variety of information that's requested. And even where there is some commonality, there's very little information consistently requested. So it's the thing of being asked for the same information in many different ways, for example. So we've identified there, you can see that figure, and we're still finalising this, but, almost 650 items of information, and only 4 of those were identical across all forms of all RIM networks across the NNI. So there's a real mix here if you think about it from an operator's perspective, particularly in what they're having to deal with. In terms of mutual recognition, there's very little that we can see where, in fact, there's only one network that explicitly asks if locomotives are approved on other networks. So again, that lack of consistency of approach or mutual recognition, it appears, from these forms. So I guess ultimately from our initial review, it appears that AS 7501 or the Australian standard is not being applied consistency across networks. We're also interested in looking at who is who's issuing certificates, and the use of independent competent persons or equivalent, some kind of third-party independent assurance. Sometimes that's involved in the process, other times not. And also the purpose of the certain information that is collected is not always clear. So it's not always overtly apparent why there are certain pieces of information collected that might relate to safety assurance. And clearly some of the forms are being used to collect information on a variety of broader issues than that. What we can see on a positive note, so noting that we have found all the processes are relatively unique in that sense, in terms of all the factors that I've just covered briefly here. We should acknowledge that there are RIMs who are doing work to address some of these issues. So, for example, we know that ARTC and ARC Infrastructure are working together on a common application form, and we're talking to them about how we can build this work to include other networks. So we want to acknowledge that as well. So what we're doing as our next steps then is that we're currently preparing a discussion paper. Maybe go back, sorry. Which will provide an overview of this analysis of information that I've just covered very briefly now on current forms, the current state, and also putting forward some ideas for improvements to processes. So really important that industry is involved in that and gives us feedback about suggestions in that paper. We're planning to release this in April. Or the NTC would release it in April. So we're really interested in your feedback on suggestions and ideas, and we've already received many of those through our consultation to date that we'll be sharing with you all. And then following this work, there will be development of a guidance document for consideration by infrastructure and transport ministers. The bulk of the work for this project we intend to complete this year, and pending approval by ministers, the guidance would be released in 2026. And obviously then the step of developing guidance material, once we have a shared understanding of the improvements that could be made, Again, we'll do further consultation to make sure that the guidance material is fit for purpose, that it's practical and it's useful for improvement. The last thing we want is something that no one can use. So we appreciate that we really want to look for something that's practical, and we'll be looking at use cases to test that as well. Thanks, Kat. The second project then is to take all this information we've already gathered in the first project and apply the lessons learned from that to trial a streamlined application process to networks on the NNI. So we're looking at a simplified application form, and participating rail infrastructure managers would work together to assess applications and to apply mutual recognition of outcomes, including assurance and compliance with standards. So it'll be an interesting project to really try and test out some ideas around what could work in a broader sense. If we can think about, I guess in terms of the elements, we're looking at a single application form that would cover multiple networks, a list of combined standards and requirements that apply to networks, and taking a streamlined approach to demonstrating compliance with standards, which would be done once and not need to be repeated. So this coordinated assessment process and mutual recognition of outcomes, we think, would improve efficiencies dramatically. And also testing the elements of a common vehicle register. This could be through better coordinating current approaches to registering vehicles, or ideally applying the National Rolling Stock Register if that's available and ready to go. And then coordinated testing, sharing of results and retention of information are all elements that we'd be trying to look at applying in the pilot. Potentially the trial may test a process that could be adopted as a mandatory standard as well, and applied in a broader basis in the future. In terms of that project, we are also seeking expressions of interest from RIMS to be involved in the trial, and we'll provide support for establishing, running and evaluating the trial. It will be scoped further once we've progressed work on the first project. So again, it's critical, as everyone's been saying, that industry is involved in this work, and there'll be many opportunities for your input. So the trial at this stage is scheduled to commence in 2026. So hopefully that's given you some insights into the first two projects, and I'll now hand over to Stephen, who'll give us an overview of the testing project.
Thanks very much, Tasha. Well, hi all, I'm Steve Muscat. I may have met many of you before, but I'm going to be talking a bit more about the rolling stock test requirements and locations, and trying to harmonise that. As many are aware, testing is an important part of the safety assurance process, and considered by most to essentially be the final gate before the vehicles are allowed to operate independently on many networks. So to varying degrees, rail infrastructure managers require operators to provide evidence that the vehicles will comply with these standards and network interfaces. There are a significant number of static and dynamic checks that are undertaken to uphold this process and make sure that there is sufficient assurance to not only the infrastructure manager, but rolling stock operators and ONSA, as well as other key stakeholders. Now, the key difficulty for rail operators is that test requirements can be duplicated across multiple networks. Also, the tests themselves aren't necessarily recognised by every single network. So there is not only duplication, but very similar tests that vary in some degree. Also, test results do not always follow the vehicle, or isn't married to the vehicle as it traverses, or not so much as it traverses, but as it accesses other networks. It typically gets lost in computers and servers over the years, and doesn't necessarily accompany the vehicle throughout its entire life cycle. So this is a bit of a problem, and we're trying to address that by making sure that there is a central place where all this information is kept. So a lot of this work is about two sub-projects, and one is looking at test requirements for networks making up the NNI, and another looking at the test locations. So the first stage of work on these projects will involve collecting, reviewing and analysing the test requirements and locations. This is particularly for RIMs that manage the network on the NNI. In addition, they'll also be reviewing international testing practices and locations just to get a bit of a benchmark to see how we compare with the rest of the world. And then there'll also be substantial consulting with stakeholders as well. The second stage of this work will involve developing a framework for harmonising test requirements that will improve efficiency for rail operators and infrastructure managers. This will include a list of common test locations, especially for specific test requirements that may be agreed by various infrastructure managers. We'll be working together with 9 Squared on these projects, and the next step of this work will be to talking to the rail infrastructure managers on the test requirements and locations. We're planning to release these findings from this work in a paper later this year, and the second stage of this work will be completed in 2026. So I'd like to hand back over to Phil and Tasha to talk about the next steps of the program.
Thanks, Stephen. So just wanted to talk about some of the risks, and we want to be as transparent as we can about what we're doing and call out some of those risks and how we're trying to manage them. I think like any program, there are risks that we need to manage, and I think in any reform process that involves adopting a common set of requirements or harmonising requirements, there isn't a risk that you actually end up, in the interest of compromise, with a more complex set of requirements applying to additional networks rather than going the other way. And so we're very conscious of that as being an outcome of this work that we're trying to avoid, because that's not going to achieve efficiencies for the industry if that's the outcome. And what we're trying to do to prevent that really is obviously engaging with rail operators in particular is going to be really important for us, because I think we don't want to be going away, working on processes and coming back a long time later only to find that actually they're not much better than what are in place now. And so looking at how we can engage with rail operators regularly through the program, and working with groups like the ARA Freight Committee to make sure that they have input and some oversight of what we're doing. But we're also looking at, those foundational projects, particularly that one around the guidance that Tasha mentioned, is going to be really important in this as well, because rail infrastructure managers can't be expected to make significant changes to processes without, I think, support and involvement of other parties, in particular the rail safety regulator. And so that's the purpose of that work, is to really set some expectations that are clear to everyone so that we can then use that as a foundation for more harmonised processes. The second one is, obviously, this is looking at improvements that can be made on a voluntary basis within the current regulatory framework. So there is the potential that those improvements are ultimately not adopted or not adopted to the extent to generate benefits. And really, I guess that mitigation, we've been working on that, the NTC has been working on that for some time by engaging so extensively with the industry. And so this is not the first time I think many people in here today have heard about the work, but really we're looking at how we can build on that, and ultimately that link to the mandatory standards work is also important in this, because the outputs of this work could also be used as the basis for a mandatory standard later on as well, if that's warranted. I'd just like to thank everyone again. I'm really happy to take questions about what we're doing. To summarise, the focus of our work is really looking at what improvements can we make in the short term to reduce the cost of rolling stock approvals. And I think we're in a very good environment for that. I think the groundwork's been done. I think so many people who have joined us today are supportive of reforms in this space and seeing improvements, and ministers strongly support change. So I think we've got the best possible environment to have a go at addressing some of these issues, and we're looking forward to seeing where we can get to over the next year or two to actually implement some improvements with industry. So I'll end our portion of the talk there, Michael, and hand back to you for the Q&A, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you, Phil, and thanks, Tasha and Stephen, for that presentation. That was great. I think just before I open up for questions, just on that last point of some of the challenges and the risks involved with harmonisation, as an organisation that was really created to harmonise Australia's transport regulation, there are two traditional replies, which are the first replies you get when you say we should harmonise this. And the first is, yes, we should definitely harmonise this. We should harmonise it to my standard. And the second is, we should definitely harmonise this, but we're different, and this is why. So I think if we can move beyond that, so the challenge for us, I think the challenge for the team is to be able to move beyond that. So I'm going to go to questions quickly. I see we had one much earlier from Brendan. No, sorry, I've missed Ian's. So is this looking at the introduction of rolling stock rather than the assurance of rolling stock from an ongoing operational perspective? I think the answer to that, and stop me if I'm wrong, but the answer is it is just about the introduction, and it's about the preliminary testing. It's the ongoing requirements for rolling stock operators to provide assurance to the regulator won't change. There's a comment there from Brendan. That's not a question. We might go through. I've got a question from Nguyen is, will there be a national body to take ownership of rolling stock certification, and will they take on the liability if something goes wrong on one of the networks? I think that's probably a question. Probably a question for us at the NTC, and the answer is there's no suggestion that we do that we take sort of centralised ownership of this at the moment. The fundamental responsibilities that exist in Rail Safety National Law aren't going to be affected by this. I'm going to just open that up to the team. Am I wrong? Okay, nobody's shouting. Nobody's shouting at me, so I probably got that right. Okay, next question. With regard to Project 3, what are the NTC thoughts, plans regarding a common testing strategy of signalling components, specifically ETCS on board, to guarantee compatibility with ETCS trackside implementation? So there's this gets down to the testing of bits of kit, and I think the best way for me to answer this is we are currently so we've set up a temporary governance arrangement prior to legal changes that we're thinking about that we're planning for in the next couple of years. And the interim arrangements are about bringing some of those RIMs and state governments and the Commonwealth together, where they're investing in ETCS or are thinking about making a switch to ETCS, such as some of the larger RIMs. What we're doing at the moment is we've got New South Wales, Queensland, ARTC, and some of the other states in a room, and we're negotiating around what are some common standards that we would apply. Because one of the risks we know is that even if we ultimately agree that the future is ETCS, that all RIMs will eventually move to ETCS, we're still going to have a problem in how they're rolled out, and the deployments may be different. So there's a real risk that if we don't put some boundaries around that. So luckily, those who are doing that, who are first cab off the rank, New South Wales, Queensland, are all over that, and knowing that we might need a solution that is applicable in distant, remote Australia. The ARTC is part of those conversations as well. Question from Paul. Is this project looking at the differences in infrastructure interface requirements that has an impact on registration, such as an RS outline gauge and bridge loading? That sounds pretty technical. Is there?
I'm happy to talk to that one, Michael.
Yes.
The short answer is no, we are not directly looking at those, although we're not looking at changing the underlying requirements that different networks put in place, including infrastructure interface requirements, rolling stock outlines, etc. We're just trying to scope this work so that we can achieve some change in the short term, but we definitely recognise that inconsistencies in those areas is a big challenge for operators too. But in the pilot project that we're doing, we're at least trying to bring together well, what are those different requirements, and actually getting clarity about how they differ across those networks. And as far as we know, there isn't sort of a clear picture of how those requirements kind of relate to each other on the NNI. And so hopefully that is some value, but we won't be addressing the underlying differences themselves, which is a different, will require much further work.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Okay, along with a big preface here, considering that much of the current infrastructure on the various networks has been designed and installed in isolation and not necessarily compatible with the operation of other networks, it's necessary at this point in time to ensure that rolling stock, particularly motive power, is compatible with each network infrastructure, including track and signalling. While the intent is to harmonise signalling control systems across the networks, probably take more than 20 years, which will exceed expected technically and component supported life cycle of any new system install in the early rollout. Interference testing. Sorry, I'm going to just race through this. Therefore, suggested in the current operational environment across the various networks will need to carefully it is therefore suggested that in the current operational environment across the various networks will need to be carefully considered until harmonisation of the national network infrastructure is achieved. Can we advise on how we think these issues can be addressed, managed in the current operational environment and during the harmonisation process? That's a really big question. It's not just not just a long, but I think can I have a bit of a crack at that? And I think the answer is we're going to have to I think play it by ear sounds a little bit random, but as long as we are working towards interoperability, we know that this is our problem at the moment, and the problems exist in track, in signalling, in a whole lot of other technologies, in rolling stock as well, power, and so on. The trick is to be able to make sure that each individual investment contributes the movement towards. It would be lovely to wave a magic wand and get all of this done in a single year, for example. We know it's not going to happen. That's beyond magic. So I think as long as we are progressively working towards, we know in some instances there will be some cases where we need interim fills, or we might need to make shorter term investments in waiting until perhaps the infrastructure catches up. I know it's not much of an explanation, but does there anybody in the team want to have a crack at that? I think this is probably beyond your scope, though.
The escalation pathway?
No, just on the previous one.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
No, we didn't have anything to add in.
No further to add.
I think one thing I will add to that is essentially we will be involved in a fair bit of stakeholder engagement, and then from a high level look at it at the risks and the safety implications to do all this, particularly from a signalling perspective, and try to understand everyone's relative responsibilities. It's a bit of a high-level response, unfortunately, for quite a technical question, but it's very much in devil's in the detail of that one.
Yeah, I think this is at one level. This is a technical question, but there is a really important underlying, very big strategic question here, which is how do you make all of the components of the network work towards interoperability when a whole lot of the bits don't at the moment. So we're certainly giving that some thought around how we do that with ETCS across the different states, making sure that the staggered nature of the implementation, which is always going to be the case, is managed always with a view to not just the long term, the dream state, but how do we get through the incremental states in the meantime? All right, next question. Will this project look at an escalation pathway, as the safety assurance element may address the management of risk? There is also an issue with the perceived consequences of increased cost for the RIM, if that is difficult to resolve.
I'm happy to take that one, Michael.
Yep.
The short answer is yes, we are interested in looking at that. In developing a safety assurance framework, it is important to consider conflict resolution or escalation where there is disagreement. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but certainly it's something we think is important to consider. And transparency is probably a key principle here around decision making and so on as well. So it's certainly in the mix to have a crack at it and have a think about it.
Yep, great, thank you. All right, from Brian, life for operators would be easier life for operators would be easier, more likely to be employed if standards were available online for a charge. The British RSB standards are available with registration, whereas RSB standards are only available at a significant cost. This is one that may get swept up in a different bit of work that we're doing. So, and I see we've got Damien on the line as well. So we met with myself and my chair met with the RSB board last week. Part of the conversations about that we're having with RSB is that I think in the new world, as we move towards, as interoperability becomes more important and requires a greater degree of mandatory standards, we're going to need a different kind of RSB. I think RSB is up for that challenge, and we've been talking to them about that. And some of the models we have been looking at are the EU model and the UK model with UK RSB. That having been said, UK RSB is a very large organisation of, I think, about 400 engineers. I don't think there's, that's not an argument I'm going to try having with ministers in the next couple of years. But I think something that is a bit more open, and I know this is an issue that that industry have raised with us and some of the jurisdictions as well. But I think we've got to see this in the broader context of what do we need RSB to be doing in the future, and what is RSB ready to do. My sense is that in 2-3 years' time, RSB will be a very different organisation, and will be a central part of what we're doing. All right, well, fixing the interface requirements with the nationalisation program restrict the ability for RIMS to deliver innovation to the below rail in a similar way how the current system is restricting the above rail innovation. Will fixing this issue result in constraining innovation in another way? That's a deeply philosophical question that gets to the heart of what do you harmonise? Where is it useful to harmonise, and where is it useful to continue to allow 1,000 flowers blooming? Because that is an inherently philosophical question, I'm going to give you a bit of a philosophical answer. So forgive me, Drew, if this doesn't quite meet the test. I think the important thing that the value of harmonisation here is interoperability. If a vehicle can transverse network A across B to C, and that all works well, that's fine. That's the outcome that we're looking for. So my view is that we need to be careful, and this comes down to standards as well. We need to be careful about where we have a mandatory standard. I think we want to avoid a technology where we should be focusing on what are the outcomes that we want to be delivered. And one of the outcomes we haven't talked about that much in the past has been interoperability. So if we can shift to make the outcome of interoperability mandatory, then, because I really don't, I'm a little bit with you. I think if we mandate, say, a particular technology, we run the risk of moving away from RIMS having to and RSOs being able to demonstrate innovation. All right. Simon Chambers, apology. Apart from trialling new processes, will we be seeking any more input and or assistance from representative of the role of the RSOs? Here's one for the team. I think the answer to that is definitely yes.
Definitely yes. Yeah. We want to use as much as possible groups, industry groups that are already set up, but we're also going to be talking directly with individual stakeholders. So if there are operators listening today that are interested in being involved that we haven't already spoken to, then please contact us either directly at 9 Squared or actually the NTC has set up an email address which will be shown at the end of the presentation.
Right, thank you. Okay, a lot of Tom, a lot of focus seems to be on signalling, but there are a lot of other opportunities outside this. Couldn't agree more. And Tom, if you hear me going on and on about signalling, it's not because it's it may or may not be the most important thing, but it's definitely not the only thing. There is, however, an urgency about signalling and aligning, largely because we're at the point now where we've got New South Wales well down the pathway of a particular signalling system. Queensland are rapidly following, and that's creating some interoperability. That has the potential to create some interoperability challenges, and it's not that it's the only game in town, but there is an urgency about it. So fully agree, plenty of opportunities beyond signalling. All right, and a point from Carolyn. There is no mention of development of skills in the industry. There's a lot of reliance on some rail industry members that are nearing retirement. There will be a big skill shortage in the near future. Upskilling resources in common testing methodologies, specifically signalling side, is becoming important. Yes. Now, I don't think this is one, again, I don't think this is one for 9 Squared, but is one for the NTC. Because of the nature of this webinar, this has been very narrowly focused on our rolling stock approval project. There is a separate and parallel process that I don't have time in the next 3 minutes to go through. Carolyn, can I suggest if you reach out to either myself or Leo here at the NTC, more than happy to provide some information about our skills program, which is a really big chunk of the National Rail Action Plan project. The ARA are doing a lot of work there, and we will be doing some joint work with the ARA. This is something that very good. I just saw your comment about very good. Well, if they can put you in touch with Leo or I, we're more than happy to provide some information about the skills program. I'm conscious it is now 3:27. We probably okay. All right. Great point, Michael. Yes, and that issue about removing line-side signallings is going to drive some changes here. So thanks, Keith. Appreciate that. All right. On that note, I might can I thank the team? Can I thank Phil, Tasha, and Stephen for a great presentation? Can I thank all of you for attending? This is not the beginning of sorry, this is not the end of a conversation. This is just the beginning. So can I thank everyone? And there's a question about, you mentioned not setting requirements about particular technologies. However, ETCS is a technology which is the key interoperability. How does this fit? The way I think some of my signalling colleagues, and I'm probably the last person with a technical bit to be able to answer this, but the way it's been described to me is that ETCS is a series of standards, and there are a series of open standards as well. And there are plenty of operators that can build different technologies as long as they meet the test of can they talk to each other. That's sort of the bottom line. Okay, it is now well done on sneaking that last question. Can I thank everybody? This has been great, and we'll be in touch soon. And but please, if you've got any questions or anything, don't wait for us to call. Get in touch. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, we've reached 91, so we